live. And without further ado, Gary Brickhouse.
Patrick, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for making me uh, easily connected here. So thanks for
Very
that.
welcome.
Doing a great job.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Welcome for this talk today here around third-party risk, as we're all still trying to, I guess, this new normal of virtual presentations. I wish we were all in the same room together. That would be ideal, but that's okay. We're here virtually. I just want to echo what Patrick said about the questions. Looks like we may have a small group here today, so I'd like to keep it as interactive as possible. So in that sense, feel free if you have questions along the way. You don't have to wait till the very end. You can feel free and just if you put them in the Q&A, hopefully I can see them and answer them kind of as we go. I think we did have a little bit of a hiccup in terms of getting this topic published and what this was going to be. So had a sneaky suspicion it may be a low turnout, but that's okay. That'll give us a good chance to talk in a little bit more depth, I think. Glenn out there, I see your note about looking forward to it and a lot of the third-party assessments that you've got going on. So if you got some questions, it's a great day for it. So who am I? So my name is Gary Brickhouse. I work for GuidePoint Security. I really wear two hats in the organization. So one is I run our governance, risk, and compliance practice. And through that, frankly, I have responsibility for our third-party risk program. So we do really quite a bit in that space. Everything from helping design programs to running them through a managed service and kind of everything in between. I like to say that we bring expertise and scalability to your existing programs, or again, something that can be completely outsourced. So in that sense, I run that practice. But the other hat that I wear that's really relevant, right, is I'm our internal security officer for the company. And so because of that, I have to practice what I preach here. And so we have a vendor management program internally. And so I suspect that the same struggles that you have in and around third-party risk, I do too. And those are things that, again, that we have to design for and plan for and execute on. Again, I'm a practitioner in that sense. I'd also say, I'm not sure what organizations each of you are from, but we're all GuidePoint is a service provider. And so because of that, we get a whole lot of questionnaires and assessments sent our way on a regular basis. So our program kind of does both. It does the sending out. We want to hold our own vendors accountable, but then we've got to keep, we've got to address our customer needs as well. So what are we here to talk about today? So really overall it's third-party risk. And really our agenda kind of looks like the following. So I want to talk about just the overall outlook of third party. So what's happening in and around the third party space, both in terms of kind of external factors and internal. So we'll touch on those a bit. Where we will spend the vast, majority of our time is around this, what we believe are key third-party risk program components. So you may already have a program in place, and if so, great. It'll be a good opportunity, I think, for you to kind of think about, based on our lens, a little bit of, based on our framework, give you just a little bit of a measuring stick against your own program. The other piece is you may not have any program at all, and great. The copy, I would say, I don't think there's any super secret sauce in what we're going to share today, and I would tell you to copy it. I mean, it's really built on best practice, and so I would encourage you to do that. We'll probably run out of time along the way, as my guess. I have a tendency to be a little long-winded, but hopefully we'll have a couple minutes to cover TPRM and COVID. I'm sure we're all on kind of COVID fatigue in terms of hearing about it. But we did see some interesting things happen when COVID hit and businesses shut down. We saw some interesting activity in and around TPRM, and that was enabled by TPRM, frankly, that I thought was pretty neat. So, and if we have some time left, we'll certainly take some questions at the end as well. All right, so let's jump in. So from an external perspective, right, this should not be a surprise to you. Breaches are still occurring. They're not going away. You can go Google, third-party breach, and between various websites that exist out there, or that are designed and built to track these sorts of things, to just what actually makes it into the news on a regular basis, they're happening regularly. And you can see, like, these are some big names up here, right? General Electric and T-Mobile, Intercom, who they actually run, I believe, radio.com. So it's one of the largest, kind of broadcasting services in the US. And you can see that these breaches happen through third parties. And because of those third party breaches, right, they were ultimately impacted by it. Right, it was a data leak. And you can see through here, right, it was customer data being impacted, exposed social security numbers, right? And if you go look, I mean, these are the big names that are in the headlines for it. Well, this bottom right one over here is pretty interesting too. This Visser Precision. I suspect most of you out there probably have never heard of Visser and what they do, but they did have, but they're a third-party provider for a lot of companies. They were breached, and guess what? It impacted Tesla, SpaceX, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. So it's almost like, you know, if you go back to the Target breach years ago, you know, that was a breach that was, you know, it hit a third party and then ultimately just impacted Target directly, and that was it. Whereas some of these now, right, there was another healthcare provider in the state of Michigan that was a service provider to hundreds of companies in the Michigan area around healthcare. So guess what? When they got breached, now we had a massive, you know, healthcare. I want to say it was something like 600,000 records that were exposed because that one company that was doing so many services for others was breached. And so we see that more and more. So part of it is this tie towards individual, you know, massive companies that end up in the headlines. But then there's this other, you know, these other service providers that are doing a lot of this work for a lot of other companies. And so when those companies are breached, it really just, you know, creates a pretty massive domino effect that's happening as well. So I can tell you just from an overall external perspective, again, like this isn't rocket science here, right? Breaches are still occurring. And frankly, like that's not going away. Like we're only continuing to outsource and commoditize services, and companies are looking to, you know, those specialized offerings most often. The other kind of external driver here to talk about is just around compliance. So, you know, it's, yeah, again, not knowing what industry all of you are from. I mean, you know, the finance has kind of got a little bit of a leg up here. That, you know, you've had some of these external drivers, you know, requirements a little bit longer than others, but we're seeing it more and more. You know, if you look at like PCI, for instance, they had a big specific push to ensure that a vendor management program and holding your vendors accountable were baked into that compliance standard. So now you have companies that if they weren't doing it before, now they have to. In the healthcare space, you've got everything from business associates agreements, right, that have to get signed to make sure that those companies are accounting for the protection of their data when third parties are involved. We see it through, you know, the big one, kind of the big topic now, or the big industry is around NERC. So when you think about electric and water and power and electric, right? I mean, that whole sector is really getting hit hard. So through NERC, now all of a sudden you have to have vendor management is a piece of that as well. And then, you know, even from a privacy perspective, so I include GDPR on here. So, you know, the real interesting thing about GDPR, and you know, I don't know how relevant this is to all of you, so I'll touch on it lightly. But GDPR used to have a thing called Privacy Shield, and so basically it was, you know, you couldn't, if you were unable to export to a trusted country, right? Which, by the way, the U.S. was not a trusted country. You could make an individual agreement with a company through Privacy Shield. Well, now Privacy Shield doesn't exist anymore. And so now if companies in the EU that fall under GDPR are going to do business with companies in the US, for instance, what used to be Privacy Shield now has to be handled contractually. So guess what, right? That's a requirement that you're going to have to follow in order to, you know, make sure that you meet these vendor kind of management requirements for anybody who has access to your data overall. So the external, again, the pressure is only continuing to mount from the outside, again, through breaches and through these compliance drivers that only just continue to grow. These aren't going away. We see it through another big one on the horizon right now, CMMC, which is something that you need to have in order to do business with the Department of Defense. That really is just it's an overlay for NIST 800-171, and we see it there too, right? That there is, you know, supply chain is a big piece of that as well. So not going away anytime soon. But those are just external factors, right? So then when we think about internal, so what are the internal factors that are really shaping and driving third-party risk? So one, I would say, I think there's pressure overall we see on programs, um, programs to basically deliver. And so part of that is, we see the C levels and, senior executives and boards are more aware. I don't know about you. I don't know if you're in a position to have these conversations, but most of the time the question asked of me is, hey, I just saw such and such in the news. Could that happen to us? And so you got to be able to answer that and address that. So again, they're becoming more aware. They have higher expectations in terms of the questions that they ask and the answers that they're looking for. And so I know I feel it. We talk to a lot of companies across the board that feel that same kind of program pressure from that perspective. And then, right, I mean, the challenges are just, I mean, I've got 3 bullet points here, but we probably could have 50. But what we see most typical is, just an overwhelming number of vendors, usually a lack of headcount. Typically, I see anywhere from, it might be one person and it's just their partial responsibility. It's not even their full-time job. It's like, hey, you're handling risk. Can you also handle vendor risk too? And so they're able to devote some period of time to it, but even that is limited. So just the demand is strong. Usually the resourcing is a challenge. I typically see that, like, from an actual like program approach, that just doesn't exist. I see a lot of firefighting. Hey, we've got this new accounting system coming on board, and it's really important, and it's SaaS based. It's going to be in the cloud. They're going to have a lot of our sensitive data. We probably should look at it and make sure that, it's a good system and that it meets our security requirements, and that, they agree to whatever our contractual terms are, whatever those things are. So there's no real repeatability to that, right? And so it certainly isn't sustainable. And it's almost like, hey, where's the biggest fire? And how do we just go put that particular fire out? And then I would say just a real inability around assessing vendors. Like how do you do it in a way that's efficient? How do you do it in a way that's sufficient? Right? I mean, like, what's good enough, right? If you just get, we're going to talk about this later, but if you just get a risk rating score on a company, like, is that enough? Like, they're an A, is that good enough for you? Do you need to see, just because they fill out a SIG or a SIG Lite, is that sufficient? A lot of times, again, we just see programs that just don't have really any efficiency, around assessing these vendors. And the one thing I would add here, the grass always seems greener on the other side of the fence. And, we talk to companies all over the Fortune stack. And, I would think that a lot of times you have the expectation that, if you're a Fortune 10 or a Fortune 50 company or a Fortune 100, that they, just like other areas, that they have more maturity and they already have this all figured out. And I would just tell you, they don't, right? They just don't. So I hope you can take some comfort from that. I mean, I do see some programs that are, top notch and have tons of financial backing and tons of maturity. Again, typically those are more in the financial space just because they've been doing it longer. But ultimately, I see like, nobody's got this figured out, or I'll just say, I think very few have this figured out. I think every company looks different. I think your dynamic of how your company is made up plays a big role in that as well. So all that to say, I think challenges kind of a lie across the board. Yeah, one of the things on here, so Phil asked the question about operational pressure to deal with certain vendors, and do we have a lack of room to maneuver? So I'm not exactly sure if this is where you're coming from, Phil, but one of the things we'll talk about in a minute, especially as it relates to contractual obligations, is, who's the big fish in the relationship. And so in some sense, like, if you do business with like AWS or Microsoft or Azure, stuff like that, guess what? Like, you are not the big fish in that relationship. And so you can press your terms on them as much as you want. And don't be surprised if either you don't get an answer at all, right? Or they just point you to some, posted online position, which is typically what they do. So like, if you go try and ask AWS a lot of these questions, they're not going to fill out your individual questionnaire, right? They're not going to answer, your unique questions. Basically, they're not going to answer the SIG Lite, right? Even if it's a standardized questionnaire. they're going to point you to kind of what their program looks like. And I think to your point, Phil, there really is this, sometimes you just have to do business. The other thing I would say, and that's in that scenario, right? We're talking about who's the big fish and do I have leverage to really work with them. I think the other piece of that comes from the internal business as well, which that may be what you were getting at too, is that at the end of the day, if the business says like this is the solution we're going with, and we already agreed, and all we're trying to do is just we're trying to get them in here as quickly as possible. I mean, that certainly puts, from an InfoSec or a GRC perspective, it puts you in a really bad position, frankly, to be able to do anything, much of anything. You almost are at a point where, you just take what you can get. Like, man, if I could just get a SOC 2, like that would be better than, currently what I have. So I think that's the big play there. Overall, I would just say, again, I think there's a lot of pressure in building out a program and getting it done. I see a lot of firefighting. I see a lot of people struggle with again, just, man, how do we do this right? And I'll say it now and I'll say it again, but your mileage may vary, right? I mean, your mileage is going to look different based on the type of organization that you are. All right, so let's move forward here. Again, this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. So when we think about key TPRM program components, so from my perspective, and again, we'll sit on the slide for a while. There's definitely some things I'm sure we could add to this, but I think in terms of just basic kind of building blocks, this is what we look at least from a GuidePoint perspective. So one, right, we want to look at your program definition. So how's your program built? Do you even have any sort of a program or anything that's repeatable? How do you ultimately execute your program? So now you have a program in place, you have vendors. Now what, right? What's your kind of, how are you going to execute on your assessment strategy? And then ultimately, right, that bigger picture of, kind of the program management. So now that I've got this program in place and we're executing, now, how am I tracking these vendors on a regular basis? What am I doing based on remediation activities, things along those lines? Is there some sort of measurement that I'm putting out, that sort of thing? So, so let's just go, we're going to go through these kind of one at a time, and then we'll see how far we get here. So from a program definition, that really obviously is kind of the foundational piece. So one of the challenges I mentioned earlier was having a process that's kind of scalable and sustainable and repeatable, frankly. And what we see a lot of times is again, like it's just this firefighting, right? That just happens. Who's the, what vendor is on the scene right now that I need to go tackle just to get some comfort that, we're okay to give them our data, but there's no real program built behind it. So when we think about a program, some of the key pieces in the program, obviously it starts with vendor identification. So how do you identify your vendors today? How do you know who your vendors even are? We see some companies, right, that, depending on how that workflow happens in your company, that might be through like your procurement group, right? If you have a pretty mature procurement group and vendors don't come in unless they come in through procurement. Corporate legal often is involved because typically they're the ones who are doing some sort of contract review. And so because of that contractual obligation, that's a little bit, sometimes, directly from an InfoSec perspective, you might get brought in because of like an IT project process, something like that. But how are you really identifying who those vendors are? And one of the, the real struggle, if it's not already a big enough struggle, I think one of the biggest struggles here is just, what we call shadow IT, where, I mean, the fact that you have, say, your marketing department really can go and, with a few clicks of a button, of some buttons and giving them their credit card number, right? They can have data outsourced to the environment directly to some SaaS solution that you have no visibility into. They just did it directly. I'd love, if we did a show of hands, for instance, I'm sure a few hands would go up of I think that happens, unfortunately, more often than not. So again, like, how are you figuring out who those vendors are and who has access to your data? It can look a lot of different ways. If one of the conversations we often have with people is, I don't even know where to start. I don't even know, like where can I even go? Like, I have no idea. Like, you have some visibility in terms of maybe through, like if you're connected to your IT group, maybe you have some visibility again through your procurement, but you don't really have any confidence around, is that even the right place to start? Is that a holistic list? One, I would just tell you, accounting is your friend. You can go to your accounting group and say, hey, from an accounts payable perspective, who are we paying money to? And let's look at all those vendors. That's what we did. I mean, even at GuidePoint, and we're not what's funny is from our perspective, we're not an overly large company from a back office perspective, where we're doing tons of work with vendors. Like I said, we typically are the vendor, but we still had, I think, over 300 vendors just in our program. Now, some of those are vendors right off the bat that you don't care about, but there were a whole lot on that list, right, that I didn't have visibility into, that were providing services for us that impacted our data. So that's a great place to start. Glenn I see you posted out there, governance and policies is the best place. Yeah, absolutely. There has to be some rules of engagement, some guardrails, and some teeth into that. And so, yeah, from an overall kind of policy perspective, your organization shouldn't allow, right, people to just go offload data to some SaaS provider without anyone knowing about it. So yeah, that's really the firm kind of foundational place to start. And then ultimately, again, you can, whether that's working through your accounting group or procurement or legal, there's a lot of ways to kind of get that information. The last thing I'll say about vendor identification, though, is there's no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet, and some of you may argue with me, and that's fine. But I would just say I don't know that you ever are going to get there like 100%. I don't know that you're ever going to feel like, hey, these are without a doubt every vendor in my company. This is exactly the number. One, I would just say it's a moving target. I think we add and onboard and offboard vendors pretty regularly. So I think that's always a challenge. And then I think there's always going to be these, kind of niches and holes where it just happens. So what I like to say is, don't chase ghosts. If your strategy is I'm going to get my arms around every vendor I have in the company before I do anything else, you're going to be sitting there a while, I'm afraid. So I would say do your best, get as many as you can in terms of that vendor identification, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, without a doubt, you should be flushing out your top tier, most critical vendors. So from that perspective, right? So if we think about it from a workflow perspective, we know who our vendors are. And so now there has to be some strategy, right, of how are you going to assess them and who should you even assess? I suspect in your organization, you're just like mine, where I don't have unlimited resources. I don't have unlimited time. I don't have unlimited budget. I don't have unlimited headcount. And so there has to be some mechanism, right, to decide who do I really care about the most. And so that's where we talk about vendor tiering. And so part of that is, from a vendor tiering, or some you may see it called like stratification, right? So how do I tier these into some sort of group, some sort of grouping that based on criticality, because at the end of the day, I think all of us as security professionals, we want to put, right, our money where the risk is. And so doing this from a tiering perspective allows you to do that. And so again, I don't think there's any particular way that this has to look. I think based on your organization, it may look differently, and that's okay too. But in essence, you're going to end up with some sort of top tier, your most critical tier. And typically the vendors that you have in that tier, they're the ones that, again, if you think about either have access to the crown jewels or holding the crown jewels for you, providing some service that is absolutely critical to your business function, like those are the ones that typically fall in that highest tier. So for us, right, we look at things like, are we giving you our data, right? That's a big deal. And of the data that we're giving you, is it our confidential data? So is it things like, medical records or, personnel information, things like that? We look at that. We look at, are you a cloud provider? So are you an on-prem service or are you in the cloud, right? That is a whole different risk profile for us that we look at. We want to know as part of that, top tier, do you have access into our environment? So for instance, I'm sure some of you from a IT perspective, right, you may outsource some of that function where people have access from an external perspective, have access to a whole lot of your data. or just access to a critical component. So again, think the Target example, right? It's really what happened there as well. So that tiering, I can't stress this enough, really is the key to making your program scalable. Is this tiering? Because what you're going to do for that top tier vendor to get your validation or your level of assurance is going to be more in depth than what you do for, say, a level 3 or a level 4 vendor, or low risk, or whatever you end up calling them. And so how do we see customers kind of work through that? Again, it really depends on what you want from an organizational perspective, but maybe your top tier would include, say, their SOC 2 report, maybe their cyber liability insurance, maybe a recent copy of a penetration test or risk assessment that was done against their organization. It may include, like, maybe you differentiate between like the full SIG versus the SIG Lite or SIG Core, just depending on, again, what they are. If they're a cloud provider, maybe you really want them to use the CIAQ questionnaire, right? That's cloud specific. And you may want everything from that particular vendor because they're a tier 1 and they're most critical. Whereas when you get down into the, kind of tier 2 and tier 3, by the time you get to your lowest, you might just be satisfied with a SOC 2 report. And that's sufficient, right? I mean, in terms of the risk that they ultimately could hold against your company, right? I mean, a SOC 2 may be just all you need. But I hope you can see in that, right? And maybe for that middle tier, you're using just the SOC 2 and a SIG Lite, for instance. Whatever that looks like, you can see, though, that at our highest tier, we want to dig in the deepest and really understand, the depth of it based on the risk that they pose to your company's data. And then that should have some sort of trickle off as you go down, because frankly, right, that tier 3 vendor, you're not going to have time. Like, I promise you're not going to have time to just give them the same treatment that you do your highest tier. And if you were to tell me, hey, I give all my vendors the same, I don't want to say that that's a waste by any stretch, but you might be able to look, not dig quite as hard. Looks like there's a question out here. Let's see. How much trust can you place in these third-party systems? How accurate is their information? Hey, it's a great question. So I'll address that here in just one second, because it's a great transition segue. So thank you, Jay. It's a great question around that. And then Kayla, you had asked a question, more information on defining the tier program. Yeah, I absolutely would. I don't have any other information in this deck in terms of something you could see, or one, I'll take that as a note because I think that could be a good slide to include in here. But you'll see my contact information at the end of this. More than welcome to just email me directly. It's Gary. You can actually just Gary at GuidePointSecurity.com, and I'd be happy to give you a response there for more information around defining the tier. We have a white paper on it that I'd be happy to provide to you. So from an overall vendor identification perspective, right, I know who my vendors are. I've done some sort of, kind of rack and stack in terms of how to tier them, right? Who are my riskiest? What are the, again, the questions I should be asking? And then we get into this assessment strategy. So that's some of what I hit on earlier, right? Based on the tier, like what exactly do I want to do, right? What am I going to be comfortable with? And so if you put your, again, from a pure kind of risk management perspective, I think the question that you have to ask yourself is, what's the risk, and how can you get some level of comfort, right? That that the controls that you would expect to be in place, right, that are commensurate with those risks are addressed. And so for some of those, it's going to be like a full questionnaire, like you want it all. Some, right, again, you'll be happy, like, hey, SOC 2, it's a, third party is doing that, great, that helps. Some of those things. But to address the question that Jay brought up, so from an assessment strategy perspective, there's a lot of confusion that I see in the market around the difference between like a risk rating program, like a risk rating solution, and like a risk assessment. And so it's really valuable in my mind to just really kind of sit through and talk about this for a minute. So from a risk rating perspective, I assume that you're familiar with these, but these are, it's an external right? Solution provider. So again, the big players in the risk rating space are like BitSight, Security Scorecard, Risk Recon. Those are a couple of the big players there. And what they're doing is they're looking from the outside at your organization. And so they see everything from malicious traffic that's leaving your website, or I'm sorry, that's leaving your IP ranges, right? They look at it, they look at anything that they can see. So if like you have a web server and it's not patched, right, that's something you can see. If you're not running the like the latest version of TLS, for instance, things like that, like they can see a lot of, and it's not like invading or snooping, like in that regard. They really are just looking at what's out there. They also look at other factors like stuff from the dark web of, whether credentials have been exposed, things like that. What kind of chatter exists out there for an organization. And they ultimately provide some kind of a score, right? Some of them use letter grades. Some of them use letter grades, ABC. Some of them use like a numeric score, very similar to your credit rating. So you might be a 790, for instance, something like that. Others use a scale of 1 to 10, just some of those things. The value in my mind is it provides that continuous monitoring, right? So it's ongoing. So if there's a shift in a system, you would know it, right, within the period of, depending on how each of these update on some different frequency, but you can get some sense, right, of a change or a shift in that particular company within, say, a week, right? 5 days, 7 days, some overnight, some 30 days, something like that. But here's what I would tell you, right, is in the effectiveness of these. One, I mean, I look at it honestly, like curb appeal is really how I look at it. If you think about if you're buying a home and you drive up to the house, what's the first thing that you look at, right? You want to see, is the yard maintained and cared for? Is the house, either freshly painted or, pressure washed or whatever? Does it look like it's in, good condition? How do the flower beds look? That sort of a thing. And that curb appeal gives you some level of confidence about, hey, if they've maintained the outside of the home, they probably maintain the inside. Now, it doesn't guarantee that by any stretch, right? But it just gives you some kind of a sense of what what and kind of who you're dealing with. And conversely, right, the opposite's true, right? If you pull up and the grass, the yard is just dead, and you see a shutter hanging off the wall, and a window's busted out, and you can see gaps in the roof where there's no shingles. Again, does that guarantee what the inside of the house looks like? No. Can you infer that if the outside's pretty messed up, the inside probably is too? Yeah, I think so. And so what we typically see there is I think of it in terms of, again, like this curb appeal, like the whole, if there's smoke, there might be fire. I don't think it guarantees anything. I know one of the risk rating providers, they have some statistics around low scores and how that contributes to breaches. And I don't have that exact number off the top of my head, but they would tell you that, hey, there's some correlation between ones that have low scores or low curb appeal are typically the same ones that are the ones that are getting breached. Now, if you compare that to, say, the risk assessment aspect, so what does that risk assessment give you? Well, it's usually a questionnaire, right, or an artifact where you're getting some level and depth of information, right? Do you have a security program? Do you have policies and standards? Show me your table of content of your policies. Who owns information security in your organization? Do you have an incident response plan? Have you been breached in the last 12 months, right? Do you use a secure development lifecycle, right, to make sure that whatever web applications you're building are secure? Like you can actually like get some really in-depth information from that, just pure questionnaire perspective. The difference here obviously is the vendor themselves are the ones that's providing that, right? So if you send a questionnaire to GuidePoint, we're the ones who are answering that. But that's where you can get some other third-party assurances, whether that be through a SOC 2 or something like that. Again, very detailed. The one thing I do want to mention here is typically the difference in availability. The risk ratings, right, that's usually a pretty quickly available solution. Risk assessments, like sending out that questionnaire, I assume all of you have some experience with that. And typically, that takes a little bit more time. We'll talk in a minute about some solutions that are out there that help you with that, so that that hopefully can speed that up. You see a lot of them now are offering this kind of network, or we already have a library of these kind of completed, so that can speed it up a little bit. But here's what I'll tell you in terms of ratings versus assessments. I don't think it's a versus, right? Even though I put that in my title there, it really isn't a versus. To me, it's a both, right? I mean, like I want in my assessment approach, I want kind of this holistic look at a company. I want to see the depth that they have. I want to see some of these in-depth reports, right? And again, depending on how critical they are, right? I want to see when their last risk assessment was, and I want to see a copy of their pen test report, and I want to see, how they answer some of these questions. Like all of those things, like those are things that I want to know. And then, but sometimes it just takes time to get those, and it's point in time, right? If I sent you a GuidePoint questionnaire today, right, it's good for today. Like it's, I mean, it's already outdated by tomorrow. Now, hopefully, I mean, we're not, like every company, I mean, they're not going through massive change that quickly. But the reality is that's a point in time. They answered those questions that were true on a particular date. And then typically, right, you're not looking at them again for at least another year, if not longer, 18 months, sometimes 24 months, right, depending on their risk level. The other, so I would, so all that to say, I just really recommend a holistic approach that involves both, again, ratings and the assessments. And we see companies deploy this in a variety of ways. So again, going back to, what works best for you and what works best, what's the best mileage for your company. We see some that, like always, right, the business shows up today and says, oh, by the way, we're about to buy this accounting software tomorrow. We need you to just do a quick security check on it. And so now all of a sudden, like you're the bad person, right? You're the one that's going to be a roadblock in this whole thing. Well, can you start this risk assessment process? Yeah. Where you get the questionnaire, you ask for all these things. You may not have time to do that. And so what we do is we see some companies that they'll leverage the risk ratings just to get some initial sense. Like, so, pardon me, very quickly, they can get a sense of, hey, is this a vendor that I should be worried about or not? And they can get some, again, make some sort of a initial judgment. But how I see companies using them, it is mixed. I see some that they leverage risk rating for all their vendors. And then on the ones that have really bad scores or low scoring, they're like, hey, there's some risk and some trouble there. So we're going to do a deeper dive risk assessment against them. So I see it handled that way. And then I see it handled the opposite way, right? Which is, hey, we're going to give everybody an assessment based on their tier. And then for the ones that we still have concerns about, or the ones, because we've found some setting that, made me feel like, they're a risky vendor, or if they're just critical and you want to provide some additional continuous monitoring, we'll see them, leverage just the risk ratings for those as well. So I hope that clears. I mean, again, I'm not sure, you may have already known all that, and that's fantastic, but I hear we talk to a lot of customers who just don't really understand the difference between those two. And I think they both have a valuable place kind of in the third-party risk ecosystem. Glenn had asked a question about, in the COVID world, how can bad traffic be effectively monitored while at home? Yeah, it's a fair point. The way that these companies work is based off your IP range. And so depending on how you're, if you have traffic that's not leaving your company's IP space, obviously it's not going to get flagged. I know most companies, and I would say mine as well, either use some sort of a VPN or you use a proxy, a web proxy, so that traffic ultimately is routed through your space. Again, that may not catch all of it. Maybe it does, just depends on how your systems are configured. But yeah, I would say it's somewhere in between. Typically though, most of that malicious traffic that you're seeing oftentimes is coming from some of those, bigger systems that are impacted or infected as well. All right, so just to move back here for a little bit, right? So we talked about vendor identification. How do you figure out who your vendors are? That you should do some sort of a rack and stack to understand who's the most critical. You have to figure out, based on those tiers, how do you really want to go assess them? And then the last note that I really want to talk about here under program definition is this contractual language and enforcement. So again, like like this is your teeth, right, to a vendor. We get vendor contracts all the time that, some are as generic as, you will use the appropriate security controls to protect our data. Some are very granular that says you are going to align with, NIST 853, and this is what you're going to do. And that really, when you think about all the things that you need to hold a vendor accountable to from an InfoSec perspective, that contractual language really is the key. So whether it's what is their time frame for reporting a breach, right? If there's a breach of your data, how long do they have to know to let you know? Are they somehow obligated, right? If they have a breach in your data, are they financially obligated to help in the recovery of that? Whether that be, a call center, or, sending out mailers, or providing credit monitoring, like that sort of thing. Are you trying to hold them to some sort of, again, other, kind of security parameters around whether it be patching, right? Or authentication, user account, the use of multi-factor authentication, whatever those things might be, right? That contract is really the one place to secure it. And I think going back to, Phil's point from earlier that we talked about, that's not always the easiest thing to do. I mean, we try and hold some vendors accountable. What we do is we just have kind of like a security amendment, and it just, we append it to every MSA, and it just says like, hey, here's some very specific things that we want and expect from an InfoSec perspective. Do we get pushback on some vendors? Absolutely. Do we have to have those conversations and get on the phone with either their, business owner or corporate legal on their side or whoever? Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes do we have to meet in the middle? Yeah, right. I mean, that's just all part of it. But I would say that contractual, like you got to get what you can, because that's really your only means, frankly, to protect yourself from an InfoSec issue. And then the other question that comes up is, well, Gary, like, hey, this, I just found out about this company. We already have a contract. We're already in, we're in year one of a 3-year deal. Their contract doesn't come up for renewal anytime soon. And I would just say, depending on who the vendor is, depending on how much leverage you have with them, that might be a good, you may have some opportunity there to get an amendment signed, right? So again, like a security amendment, that's happening more and more these days, frankly, with just all the fast moving parts and changes because of compliance regulations, specifically around privacy. Like we see a lot of work happening, kind of coming back to us because of that. And then the other is, at a minimum, though, make sure when that contract is up for renewal, like that's when you're having those conversations. As all of you probably know, right, this isn't rocket science either. The best time to do some contractual negotiation is before you sign it. So, we'll just certainly encourage you there. Okay, so moving on to program execution. So we know who our vendors are. Now we need to go assess them. We know how we want to assess them. Now we got to go do it. And so, again, we've already talked a little bit about the difference between risk ratings and risk assessments. I would just echo the fact that I would say there's a holistic need there to look at both of those. Do I see some programs that are solely based on risk rating? Yes. Do I see some that are solely based on questionnaires and risk assessments, and they don't use risk ratings at all? Yes. Right? Is that a fine thing? Yes. Right? It might be just the right thing for you. For your organization and for your overall risk tolerance. So I wouldn't sit here and tell you that, if you're not using both, you're not a mature program. But I would say that holistically, there's value to be had from both. The other thing I would say too, when you get into program execution, right, this is where you get into, okay, do I have some sort of a process that's repeatable? Do I have some process that's scalable? Like, how does that work? And what I would say here is, what I don't want you to hear is if you're doing this today and you're leveraging Excel spreadsheets, you're manually sending out a questionnaire, right? You're manually sending out a SIG or a SIG-Lite, or CAQ or whatever that is. You're manually sending that out. You're manually following up with the vendor and getting that data back. That data comes back, then you review it and look at it and make your risk-based determination. Can you do all that manually? Yes. Are there people with very successful programs who are doing all of it manually? Yes. Are there ways and solutions out there to automate and make that process a whole lot easier? 1,000,000,000% yes. So again, this isn't like a pure tools pitch, right? From that sense, GuidePoint, we don't sell a tool in that sense, right? So it's, I mean, we do in the sense that we are partners with all the key solution providers out there. But I don't have a stake in that game, so to speak, right? I'm speaking to you strictly from a practitioner perspective. That when I look at the tool landscape that's out there right now that can help automate this, everything from automate the sending of the questionnaire to the pinging when they don't respond to receiving of that to doing some sort of risk analysis against the information that comes back. um, it's there and they work really well. And then I would even say um, they're pretty price conscious too. Like, I mean, it's probably cheaper than you think it is. And I would suspect if you were to add up, the man hours of, how much time you're actually spending chasing some of these other things down, you really, really probably should look at a solution just to help kind of navigate those waters. And again, GuidePoint has a lot of great partners in that space who, we would put you in touch with to have those conversations. So then, okay, so we do the assessment, we get the data back. Now what, right? So again, thinking of program execution, there was a Poneman Institute study. I want to say it was last year, if I'm not mistaken. And again, I really should put these in here just for some more definitive points instead of just you taking my word for it. But what they had done is they interviewed, I don't know, 1,600 companies or something. And they said, hey, okay, of those, how many of you are, doing something, sending out some kind of questionnaire, you're doing something to assess your vendors. And that number came in around 60%, right? About 60% of those were actually doing something. Okay, great. That's a pretty good number. And then they asked a follow-up question to those 60%. And they said, okay, well, of those of you who are sending out stuff, are you doing anything with the data that comes back? What are you doing with it? And only 8%, 7 or 8% came back and said, well, we're actually doing something with what comes back. That's a staggering number, right? One, I mean, that's just a lot of work that's happening for you to do nothing with, right? And that's a problem, frankly. And it communicates often that most times companies are just after like checkbox, right? Did we do our due diligence? Do I get the little checkbox, yes or no? Yeah, we looked at that vendor and now I'm happy and, kind of have a warm fuzzy. I mean, that's just, I would just tell you, like, I mean, again, it's your program, right? You can run it, run it however you want. But the reality is, like, you part of your program, you should be doing something with the data that comes back. Meaning, if you look, right, and if you have a customer, a vendor, and that vendor has access to your data, and because of the job that they're performing, their endpoint devices in their network have access to your data, right? You should be looking specifically, hey, is that a risk? Yeah, my data is on this person's laptop. Okay, is that data encrypted? That's a great question to ask, right? That would identify a key risk. Do they have the ability to port that information off their system, like onto a USB drive or something like that? Like, that's another fantastic question, right? So if you're asking questions like that and you get answers back that say, like, no, we don't encrypt our endpoint devices, or yeah, we encrypt, but we don't have any way to limit or prevent them, for instance, from moving data onto, say, a USB drive, or that's a non-encrypted USB drive, that should be a red flag, right? And you should take action on something like that. And so that's where I think there has to be some, and I'm speaking like to myself here too, right? I mean, we've got to hold our vendors accountable when they are not meeting they're not addressing the risk that they're presenting to us. And so for you to go through the work and the effort to get, a risk rating score and a full, SIG and whatever else, and then we're not taking the time to actually like read it, see where those risks are, and then ultimately engage with those vendors to address those things, we're really missing, honestly, the whole point of this, in my opinion, right? The whole point of this is to lower your risk profile. And if you have a vendor who has your data on their endpoints and that data isn't encrypted, or, it can be written to a non-encrypted device, like, that's a concern, right? That's your risk is higher because of that. And we have to address stuff like that. And there's 1,000 other examples like that based on, what the vendor is actually doing for you, what service they're providing. And so again, that's where I can't stress enough, going back to the top here, around just overall kind of program definition and making sure, like, hey, are they in the right tier for what they're doing? And am I really holding them accountable well? So I can't stress again enough on program execution. I think there's some tools that you can look at that really can help drive that and make that a better functioning process, repeatable process for you. And then secondarily, I would just say, do something with the data that comes back. Like, and that's where, again, I know we get into some of these other issues of demand, and the demand might be too great. And even if that means that you got to set your focus on those higher tiers until you can either get support or something along those lines. Again, just something to think about there. Obviously, we're running out of time here, so I'll pick up the pace a little bit. But in terms of program management, I would just say, this is, I hope the thought isn't that third-party risk is kind of a one and done sort of a thing. Like, hey, we onboarded this vendor, and as long as we onboarded them and they got the green light, then they're good forever. The reality is they're not. They're going to have drift, right? They're going to have change in their environment. The technologies that they use, right? The way that they do it, probably the way that they handle your data is going to change on some, I'd say, regular basis. Now, that doesn't mean every month it changes. Would it change over the course of a year? Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there has to be some larger management of that to say, one, how often do I need to re-up, or, when do I want to reassess these vendors, right? Is that an annual thing? Do I do it every 18 months, every 24 months, right? Some of that ties into the overall tiering and the assessment strategy there. But then, as I talked about with program execution, like, are you tracking those findings, right? So I hope you are, right? I hope that you can, to not be a 7 or 8%er, right? And take those findings and hold those vendors accountable. But that means you got to have some larger program, management to do that. So do I have a list of findings? Maybe you have a risk registry. Maybe you have, again, some exception book that you're tracking against. It might be a manual, handwritten process. It might be in an Excel spreadsheet. Again, doesn't matter. But are you tracking those? And then the other pieces around, just measurement and reporting, like, of your vendor population, how many are critical? Of those critical, how many did you assess? And to me, I think this is kind of the meaty part of when the boards and your senior executives are asking, like, that's the defensible story that you want to be able to tell, is that, hey, we looked at our vendor population and, maybe it's 500. And of those 500 vendors, we've deemed 150 of those as critical based on what they do. Of those 150, right, we assess them annually, and we're at whatever 74% complete for the year, based on the cycle or whatever. I mean, I think some of those kind of measurements really are just important in being able, one, just to know that your program's effective and being effective in lowering risk, and then two, again, that you're able to report that out. And then the monitoring and reviewing, again, it goes back to, how are you doing that on a regular basis? So if, you assess a company today and they give you their SOC 2 report, but their SOC 2 expires in December, are you going back to them, right, to perform some sort of a, hey, your SOC 2 expired, your full assessment isn't going to happen, for another 8 months, but we want the updated SOC 2 report. Or again, this is where we get into that continuous monitoring. So we talk about risk ratings here. So, right, you may have a vendor that you onboarded and they're great, and their score was a B, or their score was a 730. And then all of a sudden, right, over the course of a month, you see that their score, depending on the platform, maybe their score is now a D, right? Or maybe they went from a 730 to a 580. Well, something happened to trigger that. So what are we doing to re-engage, right? And so I think there has to be some kind of monitoring component. That's where I would, again, get back to that. What's that holistic look? Again, I know we've covered a lot here, and I think in some ways there's just a lot of pieces to a program. But I would just say, just kind of overall in summary, hey, start somewhere, right? If you're not doing any of these things, start somewhere. Even if it is just starting with the critical vendors and knowing that you have some fires that you have to put out. If you aren't even doing that, I would say, hey, start there. Like, that's a great place to start, and then work towards building out this larger program where you can expand your vendor risk footprint within your company. If you're already doing some of these things, what I would say is great. Like, that's fantastic. I hope you've heard of a couple ways that you might be able to enhance your program or do things, a little bit better. Or just a little differently that maybe you hadn't thought of before. So again, that's really kind of from our perspective, to use something like this just to at least, gauge the overall, hey, am I what of these, kind of program boxes am I checking? What of these things am I doing today? Where are some things that I could be doing a little bit better? And so we got about 5 minutes left here. I'll certainly open it up for if there's some additional questions as we're kind of wrapping. Um, while you might be thinking of those questions, what I would say really quickly, I won't spend a lot of time in here, but in terms of COVID, it was kind of a neat use case, I would say. Um, all these questions people were asking, right? Hey, with COVID, are services going to be interrupted? Do you have a BCP or a business resiliency plan? Are you able to work remotely? How are you monitoring your vendors? Like, is my supply chain going to be interrupted? And so what we ultimately saw from this, frankly, was a lot of companies leveraged their third-party risk programs to get this data. They took all their vendors and they kind of just went directly at them based on, even though this, you could argue obviously availability is part of what we do from like a CIA triad perspective, but they were using it really just for overall supply chain as well. So I thought that was just, again, don't have time to unpack that, but I thought that was just a neat use case that we saw this year where people were leveraging their TPRM programs to get some of this additional data from a COVID perspective to understand just the overall sustainability of their supply chain. All right, so with that said, if there's some other questions that come in, that's fantastic. Here's my contact information. So again, Gary at GuidePoint Works or Gary.Brickhouse at GuidePoint Security Works. Happy to address anything directly that you may have, or as Kayla had asked for, just some tiering programs. So again, Kayla, if you send me an email, I'll get that back out to you. All right, so one of the questions that came in here from Phil, as a rough percentage, how much pushback do you get where the score is just wrong? Yeah, we didn't really talk about that. So that's a fair question, Phil. So there's definitively some false positives that happen. And maybe not even false positive in the truest sense. Some of the false positive is like for GuidePoint, we're an information security company and we provide application security services. And so part of that, right, is we have, stood up in essence, like a hackable box, right, for lack of a better term, that is intentionally defined in a standalone environment to be abused. That's just part of what we do. Well, guess what? That's part of my IP space, so it shows up on my list, and it drags my score down. So we have a few options there, right? Some of the platforms you can kind of carve up those IP address ranges, and so in some cases you can say, hey, this is a development area or whatever. It's a standalone environment in that standpoint. So I think there's some ways that they can help. But to address your question directly, the amount of pushback, I'd say it's somewhere. It's probably lower than you would think. I don't get tons of pushback when I point out people's scores and their percentages. Now, sometimes are there false positives that they can work directly with those vendors and address? Yes. Do those vendors have good mechanisms to input that data to address those false positives and get the score addressed? Yes. So that part they do a really good job of. Mostly, though, I think there's always some, element of truth in there, and maybe there's some issues where it's just flat out wrong. I don't typically see that where it is just a pure 100%. This isn't right. Maybe it was tied to a bad IP scope or a bad domain name or something. I've seen that happen. So I would say probably lower than you think. I don't know, 30% maybe, something like that. So hopefully that's helpful there. But that is, to your point, Phil, when you're dealing with risk ratings, that's definitely something to think about, is that it's, there is the potential for false positives in there that sometimes need to be addressed. But I would tell you as a vendor, right, it kind of is on my shoulders. Like I want to have a clean scorecard out there, right? I want to have a clean score. So if I see that there's some false positives for me, like I'm passionate about what GuidePoint's score is. And so if I see something that's off, I want to go fix it. So I think there is some obligation on them that even if it is a false positive, that they should go clean it up. Now your vendor may vary. Some of your vendors may be, I don't care, we're good. Anyway, all right, so I know we're at time here. And so I would just say thanks all for attending. Certainly good to talk third-party risk all the time, something that's near and dear to my own heart. But yeah, if you have any follow-up questions or anything that comes up later about your own program, don't hesitate to reach out. Love to talk to you about it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Patrick. And,